Welcome back to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. We are the daily business program from the Business in Vancouver newspaper and from our site at biv.com. I'm your host today, Hayley Woodin. Now, it's not uncommon to hear that big companies, they need to adopt a startup mindset. They need to be agile, nimble, open to new ideas. But you hear too that startups sometimes need to behave a little bit more like legacy companies, the ones they're actually trying to disrupt, especially if they're thinking and seeking old money and an eventual exit. Now, my next guest is going to argue why it's good to have a little bit of collaboration and a bit of a closing of the gap between these two sides. Rocky Ozaki joins me in studio. He is the Vice President of Community at the BC Tech Association and the co-founder of Now Innovation. Thanks for joining me.
Always great being here.
So give me the pitch. Why should established companies look to startups for ideas? Why should startups actually be looking to enterprise for innovation, for ideas, for how to run their businesses?
Right. So I think you touched on the first part. The enterprise needs to think more like a startup because of the pace in which the world is moving. And so, as you know from previous conversations, I argue that there's a connected generation, technology, and a sharing economy is what's driving the forces of the future of work. And so from an enterprise side, if they're not creating a culture that's resonating with the connected generation, they're losing out on all the top talent that's coming into the market, which we're hearing, by the way, out of university. Most want to work, particularly out of business schools, work in the technology space and with startups. Also because of technology, so now in technology, we know that most industries, whether it's today or in 2 years or 5 years, are going to be innovated by or disrupted by or even be made redundant by technology. And so if you don't create an environment, an enterprise where traditionally it's very bureaucratic, that if you can't become more agile, innovative, like the words you use, you will fall behind quicker. And so this is what startups naturally have to be like, is innovative and agile. The third piece is around the sharing economy. And so one of the aspects where I relate to enterprise is the notion of IP. So back in the day, it was always about protecting your intellectual property, where enterprise is, I would suggest they need to be more open around open sourcing and sharing of ideas, because that's the way the world is going. Now, on the flip side, startups, why do they need to act more like enterprise? Well, I think most startups eventually want to be enterprise level. You don't start a company of 2 or 5 people and think we're going to exit at $10 million valuation. Right. Most entrepreneurs want the $1 billion exit. So to do that, they have to start thinking ahead of time, early on, whether it's for the funding stage or beyond, of how to scale, because everything is a challenge at scale. And so that's one of the ways that startups can learn from enterprise who've been doing it for decades or even hundreds of years of scaling business. Startups don't have that experience, and they're going to have to learn that if they're going to grow.
Does part of that come from hiring people who may come from a more traditional company, maybe older than the average age of the employees working there, but they have that experience?
I think so. I don't know for a fact the exact numbers, but a lot of times when people look at the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and seeing this mid-20-year-old guy who became a billionaire, he definitely leveraged experiences from, well, quote unquote, Wall Street. He brought in high-powered executives who had done this before. And even then, I think their IPO was a failure. But to go back to your question, yes, there is something around experience and balancing that. And that's where initially with startups, it's around advisors. And advisors who've either scaled companies before or been in enterprise before. But at some point, I do believe you need to bring that talent on full time to help to go through that change process. Because again, startups scale quickly. So you don't have time to sort of just bring in talent as you need it. You got to be thinking more proactive. And yeah, I believe it's with experience and quite often from corporate world.
I think it's fair to say, too, a lot of time you get that experience and that mentorship from VCs who come on board, right? It's people who actually have the money, who spent time in business and are then giving back in more ways than one to a startup. But even before that, it's probably important to have someone who's willing to be an advisor.
And so I like to either storytell or use parallels. If it's an athlete, and so we're also seeing it, by the way, in sports and in entertainment, where they're getting younger and younger, right? And we're catering to these tweens or younger. And so let's take an athlete. And so maybe Connor McDavid is the best hockey player in the world at 20 years old. You don't think he has a trainer in his back pocket who is probably 40 or 50 years old who's done it before. You don't think he has mentors because they've lived through it. And so that's the story that I try to tell, is that it's no different in life, whether it's your financial planning, whether it's raising children, talking to your parents about how they raise their kids, and talking to, mentorship in general. 100% I believe that, we can always look to the wisdom and experience of people.
Is there any pushback from startups? They're disrupting potentially an industry. They don't actually want to turn to people who have helped build that industry that they're trying to disrupt.
Yes, but so that's where experience again is kind of, I'm not suggesting, I don't know many people are suggesting you need to model everything. You've got to pick and choose. And so, yeah, the negatives of the argument around enterprise being slow and bureaucratic, obviously, initially you want to avoid those. But there are other decisions making. And so even tactically, like what I see so often, Hayley, is one commonality I find is companies grow, particularly past 50. All of a sudden, internal communications becomes a major issue. All of a sudden, project planning, capacity planning, priority planning, cross-functional collaboration. These are all challenges that startups face. Well, that is something that you can turn to enterprise for sure. Because that's what they naturally are good at. They wouldn't have scaled otherwise. And so maybe you don't take on the bureaucracy, but you can take on some of the rigors and disciplines that they've had in place for decades. And where it blends, by the way, is where startups can bring in tech tools. And so a lot of time when enterprise are doing it, they've got some really good disciplines, but they're still using legacy tools, where startups will naturally engage with the newest and the best user experience and the best user interfaces products that the enterprise haven't yet adopted. But there's an example of how to merge the two.
I'm speaking with Rocky Ozaki. He's Vice President of Community at the BC Tech Association and the co-founder of Now Innovation. What does an ideal ecosystem look like where you have enterprise companies actually looking to startups for advice and vice versa in a landscape that's obviously quite competitive?
Yeah, so I would say, even broader, I would say in an ecosystem, if we use that language, how does research and post-secondary and these incubators and accelerating the startups and enterprise and professional services and VC, how do they all collaborate with each other? So that's number one. But if we were to hone in on those two components of the ecosystem, I think that enterprise needs to learn the language of tech. They need to, in somehow, like a corporate innovation program at BC Tech Association, for example, this program is intended to help enterprise learn the tech language, learn about the frameworks that they're using, provide collisions. And by collisions, we mean don't be afraid of the startup to try and disrupt you. Why won't you try to understand their motivations, even partner with them? Having hackathons where they're starting to solve problems instead of them working alone, have them help to solve your problems. So I think enterprise has that opportunity to learn the language and the landscape, et cetera, as well as I think there's an obligation for enterprise to procure local technology. With whether or not it's their own space or not, there's in this ecosystem, I think that's a responsibility. And from the startup side, all the things I mentioned before, embrace enterprise as a partner. You learn how. A lot of them want to sell enterprise. It's a play on the commercial play, and so why wouldn't you collaborate more with them to say, like, what do you need from an enterprise sales perspective? And what problem, how can we help to solve your problems?
Well, it's a chance to get a peek behind the hood of the car, so to speak, exactly what your client wants, how they operate, what they need.
Exactly. And that goes into that whole IP thing I talked about, sharing economy and breaking down these barriers. Why not work in collaboration?
Do you think it's prudent on the part of an enterprise to acquire a startup and sort of have that be its division that's innovative and agile, but that doesn't necessarily bleed out into the rest of the culture? So
I think it is industry specific. So many, without getting into specific sectors, I would say that in some of them, it's actually better because of the retainers they have already is to watch the startup grow, maybe advise, and then acquire. In some organization, it's better to align, particularly smaller ones, enterprise, to align early. It's a fascinating question I don't have an answer for, but I do believe that they need to just work together initially along the way before you think. Here's another thing actually I would suggest. In enterprise, quite often they believe that they should start their own startup lab or create an own innovation division. Some of the challenges that we've seen is that by having that division within their office, they're still subject to the old way of doing business, where now the model is going, take the lab offsite and do all of your prototyping and innovation somewhere else, whether it's through corporate innovation programs, like I said, at BC Tech, or just having your own lab like Fitting does with Fitting Digital. take it off site, and then you can nurture it there, or you can partner with, but do it outside of the confines of your home office.
I know we've chatted before about investing in culture, having programs, paying upfront for something that really, if you don't do it, it's really going to cost you in the end. Is that the same for sort of innovation and changing your culture there, where it's worth building the lab, getting everyone on board, overhauling what you do today, because you're going to get left behind if you don't?
Yes, because innovation isn't just about product and your services. It's about the culture, as you said. And so we know how hard it is to change culture. Some argue you can't. And so if you're not starting now with how the types of people you're bringing on board and the frameworks you're putting in place and the tools that you're using, and just socializing with the broader organization why innovation matters, you need to create that sense of urgency without scaring them. So number one, yes, you have to. And the other side from innovation is we talk about these different horizons, these innovation horizons. And so, horizon one is sort of disrupting and innovating on current products. You get in horizon two of different products, and horizon three, which I believe is more about creating a whole new market. And so organizations, it's not just about the horizon one perspective of innovating on current ideas and products. It's about preparing yourself for the next horizons, and you cannot do that overnight. You got to have the foundations in place, the teams in place, the cultures in place, the decision making in place, the capital in place, all to fulfill on these multiple horizons.
It takes time to build culture, so you may as well start now, right?
Yes, or yesterday.
Or yesterday. That's a better way to start. Yeah, exactly. Rocky, always a pleasure having you on. Thanks for joining me.
All right, thanks for having me.
That's Rocky Ozaki, Vice President of Community at the BC Tech Association and the co-founder of Now Innovation. You're listening to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. I'm Hayley Woodin. Stay with us.